Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about Recess by Skrillex. You asked for this, and honestly, if I hadn't got a request for this, I wouldn't have covered it. Hell, until I got a request for this, I didn't even know that Skrillex was putting out an album, let alone his major label full-length debut. Yeah, turns out all the singles that I had seen cropping up on the charts were actually off of a collection of EPs that he had released, which were apparently enough to win this guy multiple Grammys. And while I'll continuously restate the commonly held assertion that the Grammys are a joke, this guy beat the Chemical Brothers, and that's just wrong. Ugh, look, I don't often cover a lot of electronica, mostly because I'm a sucker for great lyrics, and that's rarely ever a priority on electronica records, and half because the genre is so heavily populated that it would be physically impossible for me to cover every single release in this category and, well, anything else. Now, that's not saying I don't like electronica. I love the Chemical Brothers, I listen to more than my fair share of trance, and I like some of the weirder crossover material, like the post-dubstep from James Blake, but I'm more than well aware of my shortcomings in my knowledge in this particular genre. That said, I also know what I like, and very little of what Skrillex has ever released has ever engaged me emotionally beyond irritation and anger. Say what you will about dubstep, but I honestly thought that the mainstream had absorbed the elements that we had liked into modern pop music, and then it sent Skrillex and the rest of his ilk back to the EDM and club scene where I wouldn't have to worry about them. And even with that, there's so much better dubstep than the squealing clash of harmonics that Skrillex rams together. And what the infuriating thing is that I can actually see some potential behind Skrillex, as some of the melodies that he's crafted, they're not half bad. But then he triggers his mutated brand of drop and wobble, and what makes a whole set of angry white boys cheer gives me a throbbing migraine. And when he teamed up to work with Korn, it was a musical fusion that actually made perfect sense to me. Irritating, painfully shallow abrasion that doesn't have the decency of having a coherent and decent tune. But you know what? I've always said that making judgments without in-depth knowledge is not the mark of a good music critic. So I picked up his debut album, Recess, which had some collaborators that looked interesting at the very least. And it couldn't be that bad, right? He's been in the industry a couple years. It couldn't be that bad. Well, believe it or not, it's not terrible. It's not good. Let me hammer that point, and I will explain why this album has some pretty huge flaws, but Recess by Skrillex is not quite as bad as I was expecting. Maybe it was the benefit of going in expecting audio torture that would leave me catatonic with rage, but this album doesn't deliver that. On the one hand, can't complain. On the other hand, it doesn't leave me a lot to really say about this album, other than just to tell you to avoid it. But first, let's ask an interesting question. What does Skrillex do right? Well, as much as I dislike the painfully adolescent and juvenile flavor that he brings to these songs, with the plastered on rough edges and drastic harmonic wobbles that attempt to sound abrasive and tough as possible, and are not remotely convincing, it is a flavor. For better or for worse, you can recognize the Skrillex sound, and even with his arsenal of collaborators, he places his own spin on whatever comes out. Furthermore, as much as I'm annoyed to admit it, he's actually a pretty solid melodic composer, and the moments where the tracks actually try to let those keyboard melodies shine through were the glimmering highlights in this record for me. Hell, there were points you could even tell that he was trying to make his harmonics and his wobbles encapsulate some of those melody lines, which was a noble attempt at least, and I would be remiss not to mention that sometimes his percussion can have some very welcome texture that I did really like. Nothing with any sort of measurable force or potency, but you know what, it was there, and I appreciated it. That being said, Skrillex is a painfully limited producer, mostly because his focus is in all of the wrong places. Instead of paying attention to a proper balance throughout the entire mix, he tends to overload the very, very top, which ends up feeling very overstuffed. All of his squealing harmonics also tend to be confined to this area in the mix, and it leaves the lower and mid-range parts of the mix feeling strangely empty and kind of devoid of good sound. And too often he tries to compensate for this, but through way too much pitch shifting, and those sounds don't tend to have the same rich resonance in the mix to trigger any sort of emotional impact from me. That's one of the reasons that I always find Skrillex's drops to feel so weak and unsatisfying. There's a crescendo, often a pretty good one at that. I'll give him, he's got an ability to there, but the payoff is so undercooked and it doesn't service the entire mix, just the upper end. On top of that, for as much as I like the melodies that he creates, it's clear he has no idea how to fit them into his own idiosyncratic style. Whenever he tries, it comes across as incredibly clumsy, melody, when he tries to shift his squealing harmonics to fit the right tune and the right cadence. It just doesn't work very well. Worse still is his complete inability to let a good sample or a good collaborator speak for themselves, mostly due to a complete lack of patience or restraint on his part. Now there are a few exceptions. Fatman Scoop and Michael Angelikos, they do a decent job with the title track. In the Raga Twins, they bring their characteristic rough flavor for their 2 tracks, and then Nicki and the dub sample for Ease My Mind, that was pretty potent. It had some raw edge I liked, but when shoved through Skrillex's fuzz-saturated lens, they lose a fair amount of their organic texture. And when Skrillex does choose to ease on, the only presence of him on the track as a lack of good dynamics throughout the mix and a just extraneous fuzz. Take his collaboration with Chance the Rapper on Coast is Clear, which seemed to be trying to recreate something of a jazzy feel, sort of in the vein of how Daft Punk were trying to imitate funk and disco. But I get the feeling that the track would have been a lot better if Skrillex's distinctive fuzzy touch was nowhere near it, and we just allowed Chance the Rapper to do his thing. But then again, with place for performers where Skrillex is a better fit, like the 2 K-pop stars G-Dragon and CL on Dirty Vibe, the song ends up approaching aggressive obnoxiousness way too fast. And then you have a song like Stranger, which talks about finding comfort in hell's flames, and then you get such a bland, dreary performer like Sam Do, and he can't do anything besides pitch shifting to evoke that necessary demonic images. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. And Look, even though the lyrics really don't matter, I will say one thing here. As Skrillex if he was trying to come across as mature or remotely intelligent, the lyrics pretty much nipped that in the bud instantaneously. Most of them are shallow, vapid nonsense about being awesome, swearing for no discernible reason, and trying to convince women for some reason to screw him. And they can't even manage to rise to the vague philosophical platitudes that you tend to find in most dance lyrics. It really does reflect a certain amount of immaturity on Skrillex's part as a producer and as a songwriter, because even by the low standards of dance pop, his lyrics are just so extremely thin. But even if you don't care about the lyrics, there's still not that many dance grooves on this record either. Even in the EDM scene of put your hands up and jump party music, the closest he gets is the title track with the interesting percussion progression after the first drop and the multiple crescendos and calm responses courtesy of Fatman Scoop. But even that's painfully limited. I will give Fatman Scoop the majority of the credit. Look, in the end, I know this album's not for me. It's for the angry teenage white boys who think this music is so hardcore and heavy, bro. And as much as I want to slap them all in the face with Dig Your Own Hole and inform them that there is much better electronica acts out there, that's a process they'll have to discover on their own if they're going to stay in this genre. But as for Skrillex, well, as I said, the frustrating thing is that I don't feel he's playing to his strengths. If he dished the juvenile attitude and started focusing more on the melody lines and bringing them to the forefront, I might be saying a very different tune. But as it is, this record can't even claim to be as catchy or as interesting as previous Skrillex releases. And while there are moments that do save it from being truly worthless, they don't do enough on their own. So I'm giving this record a 4 out of 10. No recommendation, and let's just thank our lucky stars that even if Skrillex won't be going away from modern pop music, I get the pleasant feeling that his time majorly in the spotlight, it's probably over. Thank God. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums that coming up that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, and I'll see you next time.